Hey guys, so I was just doing some work on the 60, putting a bit of the suspension together, and I was filming it for an episode, and I realized I was touching on a lot of things, but wasn't really explaining it really in-depthly, and if you didn't already get the fundamentals, it might not make a lot of sense. So I thought I would do an episode first that I could release, explaining a lot of the fundamentals of all the different components, so then when we get to doing it in the 60, I can sort of get through it, and we can get on with the job, and it'll make sense if you've watched this episode. So, if you have any questions after watching this episode, leave them in the comments below and I'll be able to answer them while I'm doing it in the car. If it's something quite technical I don't know the answer to, once I get it done in the car, I'm going to take all the shocks around to Nick from Solve Off-Road's workshop. We're going to take them into his shop room, pull them down, revalve them and get them ready to put in the 60. And there we'll be able to answer any real technical information that I probably don't know the answer to, but he'll be all over. So if it's whether or not it's valving a car, it might be like a race car, it could even just be a road car, it could even be a track car. All the sort of information is still the same. It might be an IFS ute with a set of struts you're having dramas with or something. Anything like that I probably don't know the answer to, Nick will be able to sort us out. So leave a comment below and then we'll make sure that we get all them covered while I'm around there at his workshop. The first thing we should talk about is the suspension of the vehicle and sort of how that works. Because I know when I speak to customers here at work, when we're talking about, setting up a custom suspension system in their car, I think a lot of people only see it as a one-way thing, but it's a sort of a two-way thing. So I've got my little RC car here to try and help explain it a little bit. So you can imagine, this is humming down the road and he hits a washout. And so if it's at ride height, so the diff's up a little bit and we fall into the hole, the wheels are gonna drop. Then when they hit the square edge on the other side, it's gonna compress right up and bottom out, right? So the suspension when we're driving down the road before we hit that washout is holding up the weight of the vehicle, and it's insulating it from any bumps that these wheels are feeling. But then when we hit the washout, the wheels are going to hit this square edge and bounce up into the car and crash into the chassis, into the bump stops, whatever happens. But the suspension there, the role of the suspension there is two-sided. It's trying to insulate the cab and the driver from, the feedback of that harsh hit that we just took. But what it's also trying to do in a performance side of things is it's trying to resist those wheels bouncing up into, 5 meters up into the air and out of control. Because then obviously, you're not gonna have any steering or brakes or even acceleration if it's the back, and it risks, you crashing further down the road. So it's a two-way street. The suspension is trying to keep the wheels down on the tarmac or the dirt, whatever, so that you have grip, but then also trying to insulate the cab and motor and people inside and everything from the vibrations and the harsh hits and everything that the wheels are feeling. Because if you're bolted to the wheels, your teeth would rattle out after 3 or 4 hours driving down a corrugated road. So it's a two-way street. The suspension needs to push down on the wheels to get grip, but it also needs to insulate you from bumps. And how you set your suspension up obviously depends on how your car is being used. If it's a comfortable vehicle you just drive around in, you're going to want to be very insulated from bumps. But then if it's a performance vehicle, you want maximum grip, you might be happy with a little bit less, insulation from the tires if it's going to give you more grip and ability to power out of a corner or, take a hit and just get back on the gas straight away. So that's where suspension systems need to be sort of varied based on the car and the setup they're being used in, and that's why it's not like a cookie cutter, one size fits all. All right, so the first one to talk about is springs. So here I've got 2 different springs. Obviously there's also leaf springs and stuff, but this is a 79 series this is a 79 series coil spring, and this is a coil spring from a coilover. Both springs will do the same job, obviously, they'll take a certain amount of weight and the car will sit at a certain height. Obviously you need a coilover to mount this one. This one you need the correct sort of top and bottom mounts, and this will sit in there. Fundamentally, they're exactly the same thing, just different sizes, right? What is important in a spring setup for a comfortable sort of off-road vehicle is that the spring is as light as it can be while holding the car at the height you want it to be at, which obviously doesn't really make sense because you think, well, if I need my car to be higher because I've added weight, I need the spring to be heavier, which, that does make sense, 100%. It's a bit tricky in like a Land Cruiser or a Nissan Patrol or pretty much anything that is an OEM spring and aftermarket manufacturers are offering spring kits, because if you want a you know, if I go to something that's real common, like a GU Patrol or a GQ Patrol, and we want a 4-inch lift, we want a spring, obviously the car is gonna sit 4 inches higher. So typically, you know, the big manufacturers are gonna make you a spring that is a bit taller than a stock spring, but also is, you know, a bit thicker, so it's heavier, so it won't compress as much. So then the car sits at the height that you're happy with, which is what you want, right? But what that does is means that every time our little RC car comes along and hits a bump and the wheels want to go up over that bump, straight away there's more resistance from the car to the wheels. So now instead of the wheel being able to, like, you know, float over this real gently, automatically it's got to push up into the chassis of the car harder to be able to do that. So two things are going to happen. It's either going to, you know, not go over the bump easily and like lift the car with it, or it's just going to be a more abrupt hit and you're going to feel it more in the car. So it's going to be one of the two things. If you have more weight in the car to compensate, you know, it's going to do the same thing as it would standard. But ideally, we have a real soft spring, so then when we come along and we hit this, there's not a lot of resistance there and the wheel can sort of, you know, move freely. This is a problem when you put, you know, a constant 500 kilo in the back of an 80 series because you've got drawers and a rear bar and a wheel carrier and all that sort of stuff. What you would realistically be better off doing is getting a really, really long spring that doesn't unseat when you put 13-inch shocks in the back, that will sag down to the height you're happy with, but it's still quite soft, because that way it's not going to resist a lot of movement when you're hitting bumps and things, and it's going to let the shocks and the rest of the suspension do their job. Because realistically, you want this to be kind of invisible. All you want it to do is take the weight of the car and sit there, and then sort of be, you know, irrelevant, so that the other suspension components can do their job best. So ideally, when we are setting something up, we use a coilover, because we have like infinite, you know, coils that we can buy for a coilover. We can set them up in a million different ways, and they're really long. So we can run a really long, soft spring in our coilover, and they'll compress right down, and as long as they won't bind when they're fully compressed, we're good to go. And by having a super soft spring in there, but the car sits where we want it, it just means that the suspension is free to move as much as it wants without having to fight this. Another important thing there, I guess, is the difference between sprung and unsprung weight. You know, if your Land Cruiser weighs 4 ton and you have 35s and brace diffs, you might have like 250 kilo diff housing, say. So you've got 250 kilos in the front axle. So this might weigh 250 kilos and this might weigh 250 kilos with your 35s and all the stuff. So that means overall we've got 3.5 ton, you know, up here against the springs. So as you can imagine, when these hit a rock or a bump or a washout, whatever, you've got 250 kilos coming up into the car that you've got to try and, you know, keep on the ground and push against. So the more unsprung weight you have, which is the weight down here below the springs, the harder it is for your suspension to keep the car in like a consistent sort of direction, because as you can imagine, this is cruising along and this weighs, what did we just say, 3.5 ton, and then we've got 250 kilos just hit this rock wall and it's got to go up into the chassis. We've got to push down very hard to keep 250 kilos down on the road, versus if it was IFS and it's just got that corner weight of like, you know, 40 kilos plus the wheel. It's very easy to resist that and keep that wheel down on the road and give, like, you know, good traction and not really feel it in the car. Which is why, you know, a lot of new cars are IFS, because the unsprung weight is less, which means it's easier to control and it gives you better performance. Obviously, there's a lot of downsides for full driving with the IFS stuff when it's new and weak and not really built for having big tires and stuff on it. But in terms of a suspension system, it is a good thing to have less unsprung weight and more sprung weight, because it just makes your life easier. Think of it like how much energy you would need to bounce a tennis ball, like how hard you have to push down to bounce the tennis ball back down as it comes up to stop your hand sort of moving, right? And then do the same thing with a basketball, and how if a basketball comes up, hits your hand, how much effort you've got to put to hold your hand there so it doesn't just buck your hand up against the basketball. It's doing the exact same thing to your car. So the lighter the spring and the lighter the diffs and everything, the easier it is to control them with our car, because there's less weight bouncing up against it just like a basketball. So that's basically it for a spring. As light as possible, and it holds up the vehicle. It's all it's got to do. The lighter the better in terms of insulating the car from things, because then we get to the next guy, which is a shock absorber. So this is just a standard Dobbinson's yellow shock absorber for, I think it's for an 80, but it's a Nissan Patrol, whatever, same pin to pin mounts. And then here we have a high-end triple bypass King's shock. So this is a race shock, basically, very expensive, great tunability, high quality. This is about as good as they get. Both of them do the exact same thing. One's more adjustable and in theory will probably last a bit longer and will work harder, but both do the same thing. And what that is they control any suspension movements that the spring might create or that we get from bumps and stuff. So when our little RC car's humming down the road, hits that washout, and the springs that we've got are so soft that it allows the diff to just sort of compress up a little bit, push the front end a little bit into the nose, and when the back hits it, and we're good to go and we keep driving down the road, the car's just going to be bouncing up and down until it sort of settles. But by then, surely it'll have hit another bump and you'll be going again and again and just bouncing forever. A standard shock absorber is designed around, a standard vehicle hitting general bumps on the road. So it does give you quite a nice ride because they're quite soft. But then if you go and hit a big washout, it's just going to blow through the travel of the shock. It's not going to be able to resist that much sort of energy, and it's just going to bottom out. Whereas if you use something like this, we can set this up with a lot of resistance. So then when you take a really big hit out on a washout out west, this will control that energy. It'll turn it into heat energy, and the suspension will slow down. It'll take the hit and you'll drive off. But then you'll find when you're driving along a road with lots of little bumps, this will be chattery a lot. This will be a lot more chattery, and you'll feel it a bit more because this will be not being activated as well by the little bumps because it's so firm. It needs a big hit to work hard. When you get a bypass shock, you can get into that a bit more and you can probably tune that out of it a bit better. But that's sort of the differences. A little shock, it's going to be real nice on the road, and it's going to take reasonable suspension movements and control them properly. This is going to take big hits and work really well, but then as a downside, you're going to feel the suspension movements and on the little bumps a lot more. If you then pull all the valving out of your big fancy race shock to make it comfortable on the road, it's going to be exactly the same as this, probably just last a bit longer, because then when you go and hit a big washout, this is going to bottom out as much as this would because you have essentially created the same thing. And bump stops. So these guys get really overlooked. There's a lot of variety in them, and they all sort of do the same thing, right? This is a very hard stop, bump stop. It kind of looks like the foot of a lounge or a chair or something, or even a door stop. Super solid rubber. Bang. Suspension, you put this in. Bump stops are basically a last resort. They're not something you really want to have to use, because when you get to that point, it basically means your suspension has failed. The hit you've taken is too much for your shocks, and this is basically just stopping your diff coming crashing through your sump or your steering hitting the chassis or whatever the limiting factor for up travel might be. It might be your tires hitting your guards, whatever. All this guy's job is to do is to stop that happening and hurting things, right? So it might be a small rubber bump stop that's real solid. It might be a nice big cushioned soft one here. So obviously, you're gonna hit this a lot earlier than this one, but this will compress up and eventually it'll ramp up to a point where then it's solid. But if you don't have a lot of up travel, you're gonna be sitting on this guy a lot, which then, it's gonna mess with the shock absorbers because the suspension is going to keep stiffening as this keeps, compressing. So these are a good shock for a bit of comfort and also a consistent bump stop, but with a good budget. And then these guys, these are the top tier, big dog bump stop. These are essentially a shock. Internally, there's a piston in here with valving, and you're pushing it through the oil, and it's got gas pressure in it, and it's restricting movement, and the gas is pushing back out, which is why it's extended. This one's got no gas in it. It's got a little bit. So you can see I push that up, and it wants to bring it back out. It's at a very low pressure, so I shouldn't be able to push that in. But the idea is, with this one, you can valve it so that it can take a hit a bit gently, and you won't really feel it bottom out. And then when it takes a big hit, the shims inside activate, and it restricts that hard hit and will save you from crashing your diff into your chassis. I don't know that these are as needed on road cars as everyone sort of seems to think they are on like Instagram and stuff. They definitely look cool. They cost a lot of money. But typically, like, these are 2-inch or longer stroke bump stops. And if you only have like 4 inches of up travel, 50% of your up travel is used by one of these, say. And what it means is it's really hard for your shock to work when this guy keeps getting activated, because it's gonna ramp up and release just like a little pogo stick. So if you have like a trophy truck that's got 26 inches of travel and you've got one of these with 4 inches of travel in the back, and it can take any hit, you know, all day long, and then you hit this massive washout that was too much for the car, this is gonna save it, 100%. That's sort of the job of it. But in a road car, probably should be driving within the limits of the suspension, setting your shocks up to take those hits, and then something like this as a last resort, or even this, is plenty. These do look cool. They are annoying because you've got this nylon hammer basically banging into your diff housing, especially if you don't have any up travel. So I don't fit them really very often here at work. I've actually probably pulled more out of cars than I have fitted them, because people sort of regret putting them in once they drive them around and realize sort of the sounds and everything that comes with them, for not much benefit really. So the role of bump stop basically is to save your stuff when you make a mistake and hit something too hard. So it's a last resort. They're not something you want to use as party suspension every day. If you're driving down the road and you're using your bump stops, you probably need either a bit more height, a bit more up travel, or to revalve your shocks to, you know, control that a little bit better so that you're not using your bump stops, because they're supposed to be like a last resort. And then the last guy we've got here is sway bars. So the role of the sway bar is to resist roll. It's pretty simple. If you've got a super soft suspension system that's long travel, so you know you can rock around a lot, kind of like what's in a trophy truck, you don't want to try and prevent the body roll while you're on the road by, you know, stiffening up your springs or stiffening up your shock absorbers, because what that's going to do is mess with then obviously other things. Like I said with the spring thing, if we put heavy springs in, automatically it's going to mean every time you hit a big washout with your front diff, it's going to try and, you know, come crashing through the, it's going to come and try and, you know, rip the shock towers out of the spring towers out of your car and make the front end lift. And the shocks aren't going to do their job and control that. And then when you come down the other side, it's going to be a really harsh hit, and it doesn't matter what valving we pull out of the shocks to soften it up, because the springs are still doing that. And then in the same sense, if we go ahead and think we've got a lot of body roll, let's tighten up our shocks. You know, I've got adjustable shock absorbers, or I can, you know, buy a bigger one, or I can get the valving done inside and firm it right up. It will help with body roll in, like, you know, quick scenarios, not necessarily like maybe a big sweeping corner where it can just very slowly lean over. That's not obviously where it's really a problem. But what that'll do is also then affect everyday driving, and when you want to go and hit some bumps and it's going to be real firm, so then you'll think, oh, I've got to let my shocks out a little bit because I'm getting too much feedback through it. It's sort of chattering the wheels. Then you'll go winding them all out, or you'll get them readjusted. Then you'll go throw it into a corner and you'll have too much body roll again. So what you really want is the most compliant suspension you can have, and then any excessive body roll you have, we control with a sway bar, because a sway bar doesn't restrict the suspension travel up and down, right? Like, you can go and do a jump and have 20 inches of wheel travel, and a sway bar won't care. But what it will do is stop you, you know, coming around a corner and going to full droop and full bump on opposite sides. And the rate of the sway bar can be adjusted, whether or not it's by arm length, adding or losing bend in the center here, or even just the overall thickness of the bar, until you get that happy medium where it's got a good amount of body roll that you're happy with. It's not, you know, if it was a track car, you would want basically no body roll. You don't want too much weight transfer, but then obviously that's going to restrict our full driving with all our articulation and stuff. So you've got to really find that happy ground where the car's not going to try and bin it every time you throw it into a corner, or if you have to avoid an obstacle when somebody cuts you off, but you still get great articulation off-road. Sway bars that I fit in basically every car are one piece, you know, spring steel sway bars. We can add rate by different thicknesses, arm lengths, whatever, and they're a lot cheaper than a torsion bar sway bar. They're also easier to fit in some situations because you can get around things that are otherwise not an option. They definitely don't have the cool Instagram, you know, street cred, but they do the same job. That's what I'll be putting in my 60. It's what's in the back of my leaf sprung SAST Hilux, and you know, they work great and way more affordable. So I hope that sort of made sense, and it's easy to understand, you know, the 4 sort of key parts of the suspension. You know, there's obviously heaps of other little mini things within the suspension system, but I just thought while I'm going through all this stuff now, it'll be way clearer than while I'm trying to also explain what I'm doing on the 60. So next episode, we're gonna get into mounting the cab and putting the shock towers and lower shock mounts in, cycling the suspension, clearancing for tires, all that sort of fun stuff. But I just wanted to cover all this first. So if you've got any questions, leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to keep up to date when I drop the next videos, and thanks for watching.